This is H Psychology. This is for AQA Psychology specification, and in paper 1 we have the social psychology topic. This particular question is how to answer this question: discuss explanations of conformity. So if we have a look at this specific question, it was an application question, and the question was: Steph and Jeff, student teachers who recently joined other members of staff on a one-day strike. When asked why they decided to do so, Steph replied, "I never thought I would strike, but I listened to the other teachers' arguments and now I've become quite passionate about it." Jeff's explanation was different. "To be honest, everyone else seemed to be striking and I didn't want to be the only one who wasn't." So the question was 16 marks. Discuss explanations for conformity and refer to Steph and Jeff as part of your discussion. So clearly we've got characters, it's a STEM question, so you must keep referring back to the STEM. What I found is that students will often completely misinterpret this question. They're so geared up to factors affecting conformity that they just go straight into that response. Here it's explanations for conformity. Okay, so our basic plan is to define each of them, then apply them to these specific characters, all right, for your application marks. Then we're going to remember the question is discuss, so we have to give some examples, maybe some research, and then evaluate. Remember, discussion means strengths and weaknesses as well. Okay, so what possible content? Well, the very first thing we're going to talk about are these explanations. So in order to explain conformity, we have normative social influence and informational. Okay, so normative and informational, and that's your starting point. So literally go straight in. One explanation is normative social influence, and then tell them a little bit about that. So we know the normative is the need to fit in to the group, the wanting to belong to the group. Okay, and I would recommend that you then define that in terms of the type of conformity that we get is public but not private agreement. Okay, so they're just agreeing publicly but not privately, and therefore we end up with compliance. Okay, we could add in a little bit more detail. We know that's a very short-lived thing, a very temporary thing. We would probably, there are different ways of approaching this. You could then go on to give evidence and discuss that, or go straight into the other type, and I probably would go into the other type first of all here. So informational social influence, the other explanation is this is where you believe the group has more expertise, and therefore you have public and private agreement with the group, and it is the need to be right. Okay, so you think they are correct, you want to be correct, so you go along with them. We know that that will end up with internalization. We know that's much more long-lived, it's a longer term thing, and so on and so forth. So we've done our definitions of each of these two factors. We now need to apply it a little bit more. So saying which one belongs to which of the characters. So Steph conform for informational, she's actually become passionate, in other words she's internalized it. Jeff on the other hand just doesn't want to be the odd one out, so do literally just take a tiny little quote, make sure you're quoting from the STEM, really important, you quote and then say what that suggests. Okay, so where your evidence is coming from is your little quote, so you don't need to quote loads, just a couple of words, odd one out, quite passionate, etc. Jeff obviously is just trying to fit in, and therefore, you know, we're getting compliance. All right, so possible discussion points. We want to probably give some reference to evidence. So normative influence comes from Ash, for example. Just briefly giving an example. So Ash's line judgments, try to pack a lot in one very short sentence. Line judgments, they were very unambiguous. In other words, it was very clear what the correct answer should have been. Informational, you could refer to Sheriff and Janice. Sheriff, the autokinetic effect. Janice with the jelly beans, number of jelly beans in a jar. Again, just tiny bit of information, but showing that this was an ambiguous situation. People weren't expected to know that, but they thought other people knew. And then we want to analyze. We want to give a little bit more discussion really. Okay, so we can bring in, for example, other explanations of conformity. So you could bring in dispositional factors here. If you did the old spec, you will have known about ingratiational. So you might want to refer to things like that, or conformity to social norms with Zimbardo, for example. We've got on the new spec. We can get credit for evaluating the methodology of these pieces of research. So, for example, methodological issues such as, you know, biased samples, etc. But they have to be relevant to this discussion. So we're really just going to home in on these discussion points of how effective, how useful is this evidence from the ASH. You know, how much can we generalize from that? Sheriff as well. You know, these tasks were very mundane tasks. They're very artificial. They're not really asking people to consider something that matters to them, that they genuinely are passionate about. The research, that is. Okay, so, you know, it's not about children's rights or human rights, or, you know, the pollution or the amount of plastic in the oceans. Those are things that people may get a little bit more fired up about. Here they're just, you know, a line judgment, or how many jelly beans in a jar. It's not that relevant. So do include your discussion points, but make them relevant. You know, make sure that you are judging these studies and making them relevant to your whole discussion here. So I suppose the main thing to be aware of is just always be very careful. If it asks you about explaining conformity, we're definitely talking about normative and informational. It's very different to the factors affecting conformity. Okay, so be warned of that.